Well, as I already mentioned when Jessica read the community values, this is the Reverend Jessica Lowe. We are so excited to have her. For those of you that have been out of pocket, last week, Christopher is doing a 9:15 class for the next 3 weeks. Well, I'm sorry, a week has already passed, this week and next week, so he'll be back in a couple of weeks. But while he's out, we have some visitors on the podcast. And so Jessica is the pastor of social enterprise at Grace Avenue. And if you're hearing, what is the pastor of social enterprise, you're not alone. So I'm going to give Jessica a second to explain what that is and maybe how you can get involved if it's something that you're interested in.
Absolutely. So it's still a very new thing. I was appointed here last July, came over here from Louisiana, which is my home state where I was pastoring churches out there. And Grace Avenue is kind of trying a new thing, recognizing that the future of churches kind of all across the map is that tithes and offerings aren't what they used to be. Just as people are stretched tighter financially, as kind of some of the older generations change into younger generations, that as we look towards sustainability for the future, we as churches have to get creative with how we worship, like Different Door podcast, but also creative with how we finance our missions and ministries. And so I've been kind of tasked with trying to diversify revenue streams here at Grace Avenue to kind of figure out new ways that we can raise funds for the good work that we do here in the community. And in terms of you wanting to get involved, if you have interest in entrepreneurial efforts and fundraising, even in like project management or organizing, I would love to have a conversation with you. We have several kind of new creative things that we're thinking about tackling this year, and each of those new things kind of needs a group of passionate people to journey with me as we plan and do things for the first time. So,
Yeah, so it's awesome. Get involved. You have seen things that Jessica's been responsible for without knowing that Jessica's been responsible for them, like if anybody bought a bubble wand or their grandchildren bought a bubble wand in the pumpkin patch, in the concession stand. That was some of the stuff that Jessica is doing to sort of, like she said, diversify those revenue streams to be able to keep the church going and able to do the things that we think are so important, all of the missional things that are so near and dear to our hearts. So we're so happy to have Jessica with us today. Now, we are in our second week of our Remember series. And the Remember series is kind of one of those things where there's a double meaning, because we are remembering some of the stories of these biblical characters that just have these gritty faith stories. But we're also seeing how when things went wrong in these biblical characters' lives, God remembered them into the community of faith. And it's such a good reminder to us that there is nothing that we can do that puts us outside of God's love, outside of our faith communities. So today we are going to talk about Naomi. She comes to us out of the book of Ruth. We all might be familiar with Ruth, but let's talk about Naomi. So listen to this story from her perspective today. We are in Ruth chapter 1, and I'm going to read verses 6 through 22. Here's what happened. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out for the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that you may become your husbands, or that may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do this and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Whew. Okay, so this is a long story. And if you got lost a little bit along the way, that's totally fine. We're going to loop back and unpack this a little bit. So Jessica, tell me a little bit about what you think about when you think about Naomi. Maybe give us some insight. What's happening here exactly?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, like you said, we typically just think about Ruth. I mean, the book of the Bible is called Ruth.
Yeah.
And Naomi is Ruth's mother-in-law. And so we think about Naomi mostly because of how she relates to Ruth. And we think about Ruth's devotion to her when she could have easily left when things got hard. She no longer had the tie to her. Naomi's husband died, her two sons died. And so she's trying to just kind of say, daughter-in-laws, y'all go on. Like, y'all can have a life without me. You can find another husband. You can have children, you can, have a future, whereas she feels like her life is basically over and done.
Yeah, which is understandable. And, sometimes you read stories of things that happen and you feel like the people are being a little bit dramatic. But if you think about Naomi, number one, she had been in Bethlehem with her family, and then they moved to Moab because there was a drought in Bethlehem. And so they get there and things are fine at first. Orpah and Ruth are married to Naomi's two sons. Things are going well. But then her husband dies, both of the boys die, and now she's decided that she needs to go back to Bethlehem. Yeah, this is a very emotional and traumatic moment for Naomi. And she says this thing of, God has dealt bitterly with me. And I think if any of us were in her situation, right, we would probably feel a similar way. But you brought up a good point about Ruth. She stuck with Naomi, but why do you think she was trying to push Ruth and Orpah away?
Yeah, I think two things come to mind. One is, I think we often read scripture through our own lived experiences, right? And it's always important to remember that the culture in biblical times was vastly different than our culture today, especially for women.
Right.
So I think we understand, yes, to lose a spouse and two children would be absolutely devastating. But there's an extra layer for Naomi, too, that in those times, as a woman with no male in your family, you're basically destitute.
Right.
There's no way for you to provide for yourself. There's no, so I think in some ways, Naomi sent her two daughter-in-laws away out of a desire for self-preservation for them, right? There is no hope here. But then I also think a lot of times in our own lives, when we are struck with calamity after calamity or grief after grief, there's almost a self-preservation instinct within our own selves that we push away people who may want to come in and support us, because the idea is well, if I push you away first, then I don't have to risk getting hurt again.
Loss.
Right, exactly, more loss. And so I wonder if that's an element of this too, is Naomi is I'm just going to fully shut down. I'm going to cut off these last kind of remaining family members who want to stay by me, because I'm throwing my hands up. I'm done. I'm going to put those walls up there so that I can't get hurt anymore and just be done with it.
That's exactly what I was thinking of, right? Because that is something that we do, right? We shut people out because of that risk of what it might be like to let them in. And I think for her, she's just in this moment of, like you said, there's nothing left for me. Everything's over. There is no hope. She feels like God has dealt bitterly with her. God has sort of left her, hung her out to dry. And so I do think that there is this thing of how her response mirrors the way that we so frequently ask, or we so frequently act. But there's something interesting that happens, which is Ruth or believes, and
Peace.
and listen, if I had been in this situation, I might have been the Orpah. I'm like, yeah, girl, things are real bad right here. So I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna find me a new husband. So I get it, but she does something unexpected, right? She kind of puts her foot down and says, stop saying that I need to leave you. Stop telling me to go. I'm going to stay. And so, like you alluded to, we often talk about Ruth's loyalty in this story, but it is an important part. So what does that say to you about Ruth, who Ruth is, that she refuses to leave, and even when things are really bad?
Yeah, I think we often think of Ruth as kind of this model of perseverance.
Yeah.
And I feel like you said loyalty. I think Ruth felt a deep love and connection to Naomi, and maybe even a responsibility too, knowing that, like, once my mother-in-law, always my mother-in-law, I'm going to stick by you. And this calamity has happened not just to you, but we're in this together. And so I do think we often think of Ruth as kind of this example of how we should be when times get rough too, that we should just keep on going and not lose faith and not lose hope and travel on.
Well, and she was kind of the one that was able to continue to carry that hope, right? And sometimes that's how it is when there's that person that's sticking with it with you. You don't feel like you have that hope, but they can carry it. They're still able to go, okay, no, God hasn't left us. God hasn't left us. Like, let's keep seeing what's around the bend. And I think Ruth really does that. And so to kind of tell the rest of this story, what ends up happening is that Ruth and Naomi go back to Bethlehem, and one provision that had been put in place during that time is that where landowners had a bunch of land with a bunch of crops, they were required to leave the outer edges of those fields like unpicked, basically, so that the poor could come along on the edges and glean from the fields, is what they called it. And so Ruth, who was in that place, like, I'm going to make this work, I'm going to provide for Naomi and we're going to figure it out. She does that. She's going out and gleaning from the edges of those fields in order to get food for her and Naomi. And in the process of doing that, the guy that actually owns the land, his name is Boaz, sees Ruth out there doing that and kind of asks around about her and says, who is that woman? Why is she here? And some of the servants of Boaz explain, oh yeah, that's the Moabite woman that came back with Naomi, and she's just, trying to do her best. Well, Boaz sees this and is like super touched by her dedication. He realizes that she didn't have to come back with Naomi, but she chose to. And so he invites her to dinner, even gives her some extra food that evening to take to Naomi, and this relationship develops, and ultimately Boaz and Ruth end up getting married. And this story is so significant, I think, when we're talking about Naomi and sort of what ends up happening. So Boaz and Ruth get married, and they have a little boy named Obed. And so Naomi is now the grandmother of this little baby boy, Obed, who became King David's grandfather and who was in the lineage of Jesus. And so the fascinating thing about this story, because we kind of see Naomi walk through this entire kind of redemption moment, is that eventually Naomi has a grandson in her arms after she had lost her husband, after she had lost her boys, after she thought that there was nothing left. And this baby boy isn't just any baby boy. It's a baby boy that is in the lineage of Jesus. And Naomi's redemption becomes our redemption too. And so there's this really powerful thing that happens here, which is complete darkness, no hope left, to you have no idea what is waiting for you around the corner. So I guess I want to talk about, now that we kind of have this entire story in our view, what does this mean for us?
Right. Well, I think it's interesting because this sermon series, this remembering, is also talking about memoirs, right? And so often when you read a memoir, at least what I think makes the best ones stand out, the ones that I want to go back and reread again, are the ones where the author's life is really hard, where they face those moments of absolute darkness or absolute hopelessness that we so often can relate to, and yet we see the author then overcome what seemed unovercomable. That we see them, kind of somehow be able to get to the other side, and often what's on the other side is not what they could have ever expected for themselves. I mean, I think similarly, Naomi would have never anticipated the outcome of these events, certainly not the larger narrative of being in Jesus's lineage and all that would entail. And yet, even when we get to the end of the road and we can't see how it continues on, these things can happen that lead us down a whole different path that wasn't imaginable before.
Yeah, and that idea has really led me down a path as I've been thinking about Naomi and kind of these stories. Like you said, there's memoir stories and there's other stories. And while I was watching the Super Bowl pregame coverage last week, I don't know if any of you were like me. I was scrambling to try to get everything done so that I could sit down and watch the game. And so I'm kind of listening to these pregame stories and the pregame coverage and not really paying attention. But then there was one that popped up about Eagles wide receiver A.J. Brown. And they were talking about how he had some very public mental health struggles, that he chose to be public about them. In 2020, he had very seriously considered ending his own life and ended up reaching out to kind of his Ruth, Elijah Moore, who played with him at Ole Miss, another teammate from Ole Miss. And through Elijah Moore's support, and he got professional help, he ended up finding his way out of this really difficult depression that he was in. And then he not only did that, he said that he felt it on his heart that he needed to share what he had been through. And so A.J. Brown shared that, and he said as soon as he shared it in an Instagram post, he had several teammates reach out to him, several players across the league that reached out to him and also said, hey, I've struggled too, and thank you for doing this. And I think it's so interesting that a guy like A.J. Brown, what ended up happening as we talk about kind of this story is that he not only had this redemption moment, right, where he waved his hand and said, hey, it's okay to struggle. I struggled too. He also ended up, receiving 43 yards for He had 43 yards receiving, and he even caught a 12-yard touchdown in the Super Bowl. And so there's this moment, right, where he didn't know what was up around the bend for him. And it was not only his success and his career, but also what he did for so many other people. And I saw, the week of the Super Bowl, they're doing all this press, and someone says, hey, AJ, I know you're a Christian. What's your favorite verse? And he said his favorite verse was Romans 8:18, which essentially says, the present trouble is nothing compared to the joy that's coming. And so I saw Naomi in that story, right? That story of A.J. Brown, of how things seemed so dark. But gosh, there was so much more because he was willing to hold on to his faith. And then there was that person in his life that showed up and stuck with him. I don't know. I mean, what do you think that says about the importance of that person that we have, or being that person?
Well, I think it's interesting that in both of those stories, the parallel that neither AJ nor Naomi got to the other side of these obstacles in isolation.
Yeah.
And, I had a speaker one time at this event who was talking about resiliency, and especially resiliency as clergy, because, our world's kind of weird sometimes. And how do you kind of protect yourself so that you don't burn out, so that you can continue ministering and pastoring to others. And one of the things they said was that you need to think about who your 3 a.m. friends are. And the idea being that everyone needs at least one friend, one person that they could call or text at 3 a.m. when they are really in need, that you need that other person, and think about who you might be the 3 a.m. friend for of someone else too. And not just to think about, oh yeah, okay, I've got this person or this person, but to reach out to them and say, hey, Carol, you're my 3 a.m. friend, and because we don't live in isolation. As humans, we were built for community. We even see that modeled in God with the Trinity, right? We have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, this idea idea of community, of being together, is woven throughout our scripture, throughout our faith. And so whenever we encounter those darkest moments, instead of being like Naomi initially, that maybe our human tendency of like, all right, I'm in darkness. Everyone just go ahead, leave me. I know you're going to anyway, and I'm just going to just immerse myself in this despair, and this is the end. To kind of go against maybe that instinct, that impulse, and to say, when I want to just cave in on myself, instead I'm gonna reach out. And I would say, like, I know in my own life, in those moments when I have reached out, like, that is where the hope has come from. Because even though it's such a risk and you have this fear that you're going to experience more rejection or more abandonment or more pain, and yet when we reach out to another human, it's like that connection is what makes that hope blossom within us.
And I think you bring up such a great point, because we talk about so much of the time, God will be with you. You are not alone. God goes with you. And that can feel confusing sometimes, because you can maybe be in a place or a space where you are praying your heart out and you are asking, like, God, where are you? Maybe expecting to see something miraculous or an angel come down or something. And sometimes the miracle is that person.
Right.
That is how God is with us. Ruth was how God was with Naomi. A.J. Brown and Elijah Moore. Elijah was how that godly presence showed up in his life that said, hey, I'm not going to leave you. I know that you're in a really dark spot, but there's nothing that you can do right now that's going to push me away. So I think that that's a really critical part of the story, of thinking about that. And then I think there's this other piece that is really important to be brought in, because I was thinking about, again, like these types of stories where it feels so dark. I thought about how the disciples felt, right? Like the disciples had followed Jesus, had believed, like, okay, the Messiah has come. This is our redemption. And then all of a sudden they watched this man that was part human, part God, die. And it was really confusing. And I imagine, or I think about the disciples in those 3 days, and I'm thinking they had to have felt like Naomi did. Right. Like everything had sort of crumbled in a way, right?
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I wonder too, there's a lot of different things that we can talk about as to why there were 12 disciples, but it is interesting that Jesus didn't just call one person to be like his right-hand man, right? Of like, I'm going to tell you all the stuff and you're going to keep it going. And Jesus didn't call 2 people, but Jesus called a whole 12 people, like a whole small group, right? To carry on this message and to also to bear the weight of that loss and that sorrow together, so that they could have one another to turn to and to grapple with what does this mean, and to kind of try to make those connections of like, oh yeah, Jesus did tell us this was coming, but we just didn't quite, grasp
understand it. Right.
Yeah.
I said all of a sudden, and really there's like all of these like very clear hints that are dropped. But to them, it felt like all of a sudden like this hope is gone. And so they are like, they process this in community. And then of course we know the redemption story, right? We know that Jesus came back. Jesus came back for us. And I think that is part of this narrative too, is that Jesus will come back for us every single time, even when we are like, we are done. We are done with faith. We are done with religion. I have been hurt by church. This has happened to me. I want out. That's just not who God is. And I think we see it in this story. I think we see it several times throughout the Bible, but also in the story of Jesus.
Yeah. And I think we can get so stuck sometimes on like, we have our own life as this narrative, and we think, okay, this is the only logical way it can end. Like Naomi thought the only logical solution could be for her 2 daughter-in-laws to be married to her sons, to have children from them. And there's even this kind of funny, kind of strange part of this story where, Naomi is telling them, like, y'all have to leave, you have to leave, telling her daughter-in-laws. And, Ruth's like, I'm going to stay with you. And she's like, look, even if I found another husband and he somehow managed to get me pregnant, like, what are you going to wait for that kid to grow up to marry him and have kids? Like, no, so even in her mind, she's so stuck on this idea that like that narrative can't continue. Like, I cannot have a son for you to marry and have kids with. And yet, there's this whole other option, this whole other alternative story that she couldn't even imagine, that Ruth would meet someone else, would meet Boaz, that they would be grafted in to this story. Because another thing we haven't talked about, but Ruth being a Moabite, like that doesn't mean a lot to us today.
Yeah.
But they were outside the story, really. Like Moabites were not Israelites. They weren't God's chosen people. They were the outsiders.
Right.
And so that even makes it like more difficult for this solution to have ever been imagined, that Ruth would then marry an Israelite and be grafted in to God's story.
Gosh, I think you bring up such a good point, is in our own human perspective, what we are able to see is so limited.
Yeah.
And you're right, we see Naomi doing it, thinking, okay, well, this is the only possibility, and it could only go this way. But we don't know what is in the mind of God. We can't possibly imagine that. And that's why I think some of these things are just so beautiful. Because again, with Naomi, I think of her holding Obed. She could not have imagined that was up around the bend for her. I think of A.J. Brown catching that touchdown pass, and the crowd is screaming, and he's looking up thinking, I did not know this was coming. And it kind of gives me this just, I don't know, like brilliant, like overwhelming love for who God is and what God is capable of doing in our lives. So before we wrap up, I want to mention the memoir that I kind of saw in relationship to this story. So I already talked a lot about A.J. Brown. We've talked about Naomi, talked about the story of Jesus, how we've seen these things. But because we've been encouraging you guys to check out the Atlas, which if you don't know what the Atlas is, we have some paper copies around. It is a list of all of the sermons that we have for the year. And in this particular series, we have some memoirs that are included on that page. And the story of Naomi, I really connected it to the story of Beth Moore. That's one of the memoirs that are listed there. And I don't know if you guys know who Beth Moore is, but as a former Southern Baptist, if any of you are Southern Baptists out there, I would think there's no way you don't know who Beth Moore is, because she's kind of the queen, or was sort of the queen of Southern Baptists. She wrote all sorts of devotional books. She was well known in the 90s for selling out arenas, doing women's ministry. And I love her, because like the first devotional I ever did was by Beth Moore. Like as a preteen, I'm doing her things. And this book tells a really interesting story about her life. Beth had suffered her entire childhood with inappropriate conduct and abuse at the hands of her father. And so that really colored her life and who she is. And there's a lot about that in this book. But there came a time where she was seeing inappropriate comments being made by leadership in the Southern Baptist Church, by leadership that the Southern Baptist Church supported. And she spoke out against some comments that were inappropriate at the various highest level. And in doing so, she put a target on her back. That was not seen as something that she should do or that she had the authority to do. And she ended up being pushed out of the Southern Baptist Convention and kind of lost her community and lost this world that she literally was the queen of, so ingrained in. And so we see Beth Moore kind of have this Naomi-like moment. And there is a beautiful part in the book that I don't want to ruin for you if you read it, but she decides to go into another space of worship. And there is this healing moment where we see, again, God doing the brilliant thing, the miraculous thing, something that Beth could not have expected. And today, Beth Moore's circle is so much wider and so much more inclusive. And she has been a drum major for women and for speaking out against the assault of women, the way that we talk about women. And she didn't know that that's what her life was going to be like. But God made something beautiful of it. And so as we're talking about, the story of Naomi, and we talk about other people's stories, I think it is helpful for us to go through and maybe look at some of these modern day stories, because it reminds us that God is still in the business of restoration. It didn't just happen back, over 2,000 years ago for Naomi. Right. It's happening for people now. So I just wanted to invite you into that memoir because it is so great. For those of you that might be in a space thinking, okay, I'm totally in the dark, to remind you that there is light. God is still showing up in the light. Absolutely. So I guess as we wrap up, Jessica, do you have any closing thoughts, anything else brilliant that you want to share with us? Because you've shared a lot of good truth with us today.
No, I think I like what you said. And I think for us, too, to just reflect on our own lives, which I think is something we don't often take time for because life moves at such a fast pace. And we're always just kind of focused on what has to be done today, what has to be done tomorrow, right? And we don't often take time to just sit still and think about what has come before. But I think all of us have had those kind of moments, maybe not as severe as our whole world being in darkness, or maybe that severe. I mean, we've all experienced grief and loss and things that have happened that have taken the narrative we thought was going one direction and completely pivoted it in another. But whenever we are able to take time and sit with it and think back, we can see kind of that breadcrumb trail of transformation in our own lives. And we can see how I never thought I would be here today back then. Back then, maybe my hopes and dreams were totally different. My image of the future was totally different. And yet this twist came, and that wasn't a pleasant twist, right? We don't want bad things to happen to us. Those things are awful. But just as we read in the memoirs, often when those really hard things happen, it forces us to transform in a way that we could never have imagined. And sometimes that is an even more beautiful ending, more beautiful future than what could have come if we had just kept plodding forward in the way we always thought it would be.
Amen. It makes me think of God does more than we could ask or imagine.